Welcome to the 1600 Sessions, a podcast presented by the White House Historical Association. In each episode, White House Historical Association President Stuart McLaurin interviews luminaries, historians, and eyewitnesses to history about America's most famous residence and office, the White House. We open the doors to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue because it's not only the president's house, it's the people's house. Who takes care of the thousands of historic artifacts in the White House, cataloging everything from presidential portraits to presidential china? And how do they balance the needs of a building that is both a museum and symbol of American democracy, as well as an office and family home? In this episode, we'll be talking about the role of White House curator. We'll hear about how the curator's office cares for a house full of American treasures, including some of the more unusual items in White House history.
Well, there's a chair that was made out of a log. Somebody sent it to President Hoover in 1932 for the 200th anniversary of the birth of George Washington. It's surprisingly comfortable. It's just kind of a barrel chair. It's like, if you just cut away the part of the front of a log and then hollowed out the inside of it. And I don't know that it ever had any real use until the designer saw the chair. I told him what it was. He says, I think that's fabulous. And so for 8 years, it was a regular part of the furnishings of the solarium.
White House Historical Association President Stuart McLaurin interviews former curator William Allman about his experiences caring for the White House through 8 presidential administrations.
Welcome to today's podcast by the White House Historical Association from our offices on historic Lafayette Square overlooking the White House. In previous episodes, we've talked about the White House as a living museum. There's one key person and staff responsible for ensuring that all the artifacts are preserved and accounted for and well managed. And they do this for the presidents who are in office, but also the visitors who visit the White House by the thousands each year. This is a very important role, and it's the office of the curator of the White House. In a previous episode, we heard from former curator Betty Muckman about the history of presidential portraits. Today, we're honored to have with us the most recent curator, William Allman, to talk more about this crucial behind-the-scenes role at the White House. Bill started working in the curator's office in 1976 during the American Bicentennial celebration. Through the course of his career, he served as a curatorial assistant, then assistant curator, and was appointed curator in 2002. He just retired this summer after 40 years of service to the White House, and we're very honored to have the privilege of talking with him today. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
Bill, the curator is a very important role, and it's the sort of institutional memory of the White House, certainly regarding objects and furnishings and the interiors. It also has an important relationship with the White House Historical Association, with us. Tell us about how the curator's position began and about that historic relationship with our association.
Well, the curator was created at the request of First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy in 1961. When she came to the White House, she really saw an opportunity to take a house that was visited and make it a house that was a destination to be visited, with a collection of furnishings and fine arts that would tell a great story about America and the nation and the people who have occupied the White House. It was created with the idea that there was an old collection at the house when Mrs. Kennedy arrived. These were the things that had survived, mostly being acquired new in past generations, and that had survived in the White House. In the 19th century, it was perfectly legitimate for an incoming President First Lady to have a garage sale. They were authorized by the Congress. Here's some money to move in, and if it's not enough, you can sell off those things which they rather euphemistically called decayed property. It was whatever they found in the house that they didn't find stylish any longer. The very famous one was Chester Arthur in 1882, sent off 24 wagon loads of White House property to the auction block. So the things that had survived, some of them were interesting, some of them were truly fantastic. Then Mrs. Kennedy started the new collection, which was acquire something, additional things to make the collection stronger. the rooms more beautiful, the attraction to the public greater and more lasting. Not long after that, she encouraged the creation of the White House Historical Association to publish a guidebook, which would then be used by the many new visitors coming to the White House to see all the great things that she and her curator were accomplishing. And so the curator needed to be a person who could collect, who could research, who could interpret, preserve, and then find the proper settings for making the rooms and the objects work together. So as a result, the curator's office was created and then sort of formalized by executive order under President Johnson. And ever since, there's been a small but dedicated group working within the resident staff, unlike many museums where the curators might have rather complete control over handling of objects. In our case, it's a living house museum, and so objects are furniture sat on, carpets are walked on, china's eaten off of. And so, damage happens, and part of our job is to limit that, to find the best ways to move things, the best ways to use things for regular service, and then to make amends when something gets, upholsteries get worn or spilled on, or something gets torn, or a piece of furniture gets, broken.
And that's an example where we have a collaborative relationship with you in restoring and replacing some of those items as well.
Yes, the association's part of its sponsorship of our operations has included collections care in various categories, both furniture, glassware, china, mirrors, picture painting frames, as well as refurbishing of public rooms out of the Endowment Trust, acquisitions for the permanent collection out of the Acquisition Trust.
Thank you for making the plug for the guidebook that was begun, first printed, as you said, in 1962, and we've just published the newest edition, the 24th edition of that guidebook, which is available to those of you listening on the podcast today and available through our website at whitehousehistory.org. And we also have another new book that's just out on White House China. And I believe you're the author of that book, Bill. Tell us about that book and the various presidential china over the years. When did it first come into being, and why is that an important representation of presidents in the White House collection?
Well, the china was probably the first thing that was treated as something to be exhibited. The house was a home, the house was a stage for public entertaining, and an office for the president. But it was Caroline Harrison, the wife of President Benjamin Harrison, in 1889, who was very interested in china as an art form. She participated in hand painting blanks of china. And she was interested in what did the house own that would show the tastes of the people who had gone before her. And so she went to the pantries and she talked to the staff and she said, what do we have and who does it belong to? And she tried to create a china collection, and then it was exhibited in the ground floor corridor in cabinets early in the 20th century, moved into the current china room under Edith Wilson, the second Mrs. Woodrow Wilson, in 1917, as a room devoted to china and other tableware, glassware, and metalware as well. But the china was something that came out of that money that the Congress gave to the families as part of your moving in, so it wasn't like every president had a china service. It was a function of, had taste changed? Had there been so much breakage that you really needed a new service in order to meet the demands of the house? And so china services clear up through the Johnson administration were actually only made for 120. That was considered enough to serve a state dinner. Mrs. Johnson was the first to have a service that was made for 220 to cover the needs of more modern entertaining. And as times have gone along now, the most recent service was ordered for 320 to cover the possibility of having an East Room dinner, a state dining room dinner, or a dinner that expands into adjacent parlors as well.
And are some of those historic china services still used?
Yes. With the older ones where there's limited numbers, the rarity dictates that we try to persuade First Lady and Social Secretary that no, we don't want to really use the Lincoln china for lunch. But back through the 1903 Theodore Roosevelt service, the china services are available to be used at different scales.
You have a wonderful, capable staff that works with you in the curator's office, or you did before you retired. And tell us about their roles and what roles they undertake. And where is your office in the White House?
Well, our office is on the ground floor, not quite directly across from the china room, in 2/3 of what was the original White House kitchen that was under the entrance hall, a very large room with a big fireplace at each end. By the addition of the north portico in 1829-30, they pretty much covered the outside windows to that kitchen, and so the kitchen was later in the mid-19th century moved to where it is now in the northwest corner. And so our office has one of these big old fireplaces that's left over from the one time being a kitchen, though in the Truman renovation they eliminated it having any flue. So it's very pretty, but we filled it full of filing cabinets because we can't actually start a fire in it. So it's a tight space. We have 5 people, including myself, there were 5 of us on the staff. It's been divided into an assistant curator for fine arts, who principally worked on paintings, sculpture, frames, photography. A curator for decorative arts, whose job was textiles, furniture, glass, ceramics, silver. And then a collections manager / registrar, the typical museum person whose job is to deal with inventory, loans, insurance, and shipping in and out if we're borrowing from other institutions and returning things safely. And then a curatorial assistant administrative person to help with all other departments as needed.
So you served in the office of the curator or as curator for 40 of the 56 years that office was in existence. How did the office and the function change over time?
In a 90-person resident staff where most people are doing food service, housekeeping, we were sort of the conscience in some respect of the house and the collection, always trying to look at ways to preserve things. I don't know that it's changed drastically over those times. It was always I don't want to call it a battle, but there was clearly a dichotomy between providing family services as quickly as possible versus the curators saying, well, everything is beautiful, please don't touch, please don't move. That's hard for some of our staff as well as administration staff sometimes to understand that. And one of the things we always say is that the guests are invited and they get to sit on the furniture. Now, when you're an employee, you don't sit on the furniture because it's the cumulative effect of sitting on the furniture that damages the fabric, weakens the joints in a chair or whatever. And so the idea is to make it last as long as possible. You cut down on the contact. Hands, there's all sorts of oils in your skin, that if you've ever seen the edge of the East Building of the National Gallery where people have rubbed their hands on that narrow, and it's, it's brown. The stone is pink, but, because it's what happens.
Prior to 1961, the year that Mrs. Kennedy created the function and the role of the curator in the White House, who kept track of those historic artifacts and how systemized was it prior to your creation?
Well, an inventory was required by law since 1901. There had been some inventories taken before that, usually towards the end of an administration with the idea that the outgoing president wanted to prove to the Congress that he was leaving behind the things that belonged to the government. And the inventories were rudimentary at best. Many times it would say chair 4 legs. That's about all chairs almost. And they would count, they'd go into the kitchens and they would count egg beater broken. Down to things that we don't count anymore because they're too financially inconsequential. Inventory was done annually up until 1930. It was signed by the President of the United States. He would sign that this was an authentic inventory. After that, they decided it really made more sense for the chief usher to sign it because how did the president know it was authentic if the chief usher was really the person in charge of the building? So pretty much the care before Mrs. Kennedy, before there was a curator's office, would have been in the hands of the chief usher and the housekeeper were probably the people that handled, and then the Park Service was empowered to do the inventory, so they would have some say in storing and taking care of things as well.
So you've talked about the wagon loads of things that were carted off and the garage sales that they would have. At some point, it became a formal collection and a museum standard for the White House. When did that take place, and how has that change impacted the role, purpose, integrity of the collection at the White House?
Well, it sort of started in 1902 with Theodore Roosevelt. When he did a renovation of the house, it pretty much stopped it being current in its decor. And so the house stopped being absolutely up to date. There was no Art Deco room in the White House ever as a result of the Theodore Roosevelt efforts. So Mrs. Hoover, when she came into the White House, she was very interested in documenting things that had survived in the house and brought in a woman that she worked with, Dara McMullen, and they created a wonderful guide to things in the house, things that they knew at the time. They put numbers, first physical numbers on pieces, and we still have the oldest ones have little tiny metal diamonds nailed to the frames that would say 4, 12, 53. The problem was they kind of went around the house and gave the numbers where they found the pieces. So you might have a set of 12 chairs that are not sequentially numbered because 2 were in one room and 5 were in another room. And so, you'd find in their inventory, it would say this is chair 12, 17, 83, 91, and 150. But she did a lot of interesting research at the time. Because of the China collection, there was some work done in the 1950s by Margaret Klapthor from the Smithsonian, who wrote the first edition of the China book for Mrs. Eisenhower in trying to update and get better data on the china that was on the exhibit. So that kind of led to Mrs. Kennedy, so she had things that had numbers. So those took on a whole new specialness. If it had a number, if it was an old collection piece with an identified number, it was like you couldn't get rid of it. Even if it was just a utilitarian thing that you wouldn't number now because it's considered monetarily too inconsequential to worry about it, like the broken egg beater or whatever.
We talked about Mrs. Kennedy and her role in creating the curator and inspiring the founding of the White House Historical Association, but certainly there have been other First Ladies prior to Mrs. Kennedy and since Mrs. Kennedy who have been very interested in the history of the house and its collection. Tell us about a few of those that in your mind have had a significant impact on the White House.
Well, I think Mrs. Hoover was the first principal one because she tried to actually accession and identify objects. Since then, every First Lady has been enormously interested in the history of the house. Like Mrs. Johnson decided that Mrs. Kennedy had done so many great things for the house that she would concentrate more on gardening and the landscape, but still there was a fantastic acquisitions in the Johnson administration, especially in terms of American art. Mrs. Nixon was very behind the scenes, understated, in a huge amount of work was done in the public rooms under her, but she didn't look for publicity. I don't know that Mrs. Kennedy looked for publicity, she just drew publicity. But Mrs. Nixon, there was a lot of press coverage in the 1970s. The Washington Post and the Washington Star would write regular articles about the White House announced a new acquisition. I mean, it was newsworthy. Doesn't happen as much today. And every First Lady since has tried to put their stamp on improving the collection, adding to the art and the furnishings.
How important is it to identify and return objects, items to the White House that may have once been in the White House but left during one of these periods that you spoke about earlier?
It's always been one of our goals. I know when Mrs. Kennedy was there, people came to her all the time with these things came from the White House. And ever since, we've gotten lots of letters from people. Grandmother always said this came from one of the White House sales or whatever. And unfortunately, you can't prove many of them because we either don't have comprehensive inventories or the photographs of the rooms don't show every angle of the room. So you can't categorically say, in some cases you could look at it and say, that was made in 1930, it's not Dolly Madison. I mean,
well, I've heard you speak of someone bringing a bed that they thought had been Abraham Lincoln's bed. And how did you know it wasn't Abraham Lincoln's bed?
We know there was a bed that they bought to be the principal guest bed, a big, the tall, high-backed bed that we have now in the Lincoln bedroom that has survived here continuously. I think the assumption was there, it was just that because it matched the one we had, it had to be the mate.
I see.
Not because the person had any proof that it came from the Lincoln White House. It was just that there was sort of the presumption that the identical had to be, that one that they were commissioned by the White House. As many times they assume that if it's really big and beautiful, it had to have been specially made. But in the Victorian era, that was not really true. They were making big and elaborate for every house in America.
And there's no law that says the blue room must be blue. So what traditions govern how the state floor is maintained?
Well, the color-coded parlors got their names in between the 1820s and the 1840s. Green room was called the Green Drawing Room in the 1825 inventory, so presumably President Monroe had already introduced green fabrics. Generally, in those early eras before there was gas lighting and electric lighting, green would not have been the walls. It would have been the fabrics at the windows, on the chairs, as the carpet. And the walls would have been light colored to help reflect candlelight and whale oil lamps. So then the Blue Room got its name next in 1837 under President Van Buren. So in fact, when the Monroe furniture arrived that we're celebrating this year, it in fact was there for 20 years in crimson upholsteries before the room color was changed. And then the Red Room was named so in 1845 under President Polk, and so having been the yellow drawing room in Mrs. Madison's time. But since then, they kind of took on these names and were kept in those colors. And then it was in the early part of the 20th century that President Theodore Roosevelt had the fabrics put on the walls where, if he said, meet me in the green room, you didn't miss the green room because the walls were green, where they would have been wallpapered or painted lighter colors in the previous administrations.
You've talked about the White House being the office to the president and the home to the president and his family. So these rooms get a lot of use and a lot of activity taking place in these spaces. Tell us about how you worry and care for these objects in these rooms when people are just trying to have a press conference or trying to have a meeting and they're worried about their business, but you have to worry about the spaces.
Sometimes we can't control things. We don't even know sometimes. Fortunately, the people that work with us on the residence staff, we have an operations crew whose job is to move furniture. You have the electrical office that's responsible for, lighting and usually for television cameras and any kind of taping activities. So pretty much we harp at them a lot about, what to do correctly and what to discourage people from doing and how to stand up for the residents when someone wants to do something that's really not wise in our minds. But there are times when you come upstairs because one of those offices or the usher's office will call and say, we need a curator up here to explain to them why this is bad. No, you can't put this high voltage light within 6 inches of the portrait of George Washington. That's just not allowed. And then you see some of the tapings that happen from, the performances at the White House that are regularly done, and they bring in a huge amount of equipment and set up scaffolding and such, and they're very, very careful. The people from public television are extremely proud of their long and unblemished career at staging things without damaging stuff. So sometimes you actually become confident that the people from the outside know what they're doing.
Clearly, different presidents and first ladies have different tastes and styles. How do you see that change from administration to administration, and how does your office, or how did you work with them to facilitate their style changes?
Most change takes place in the private quarters and in the Oval Office, spaces that are not technically within the purview of the Committee for the Preservation of the White House to be maintained with a museum character.
Tell us about the Committee for the Preservation of the White House.
In 1964, President Johnson formalized Mrs. Kennedy's Fine Arts Committee, that was an advisory committee, and created by executive order a committee that can consist of as many people as the president wants to, but it has to include certain key federal officers, the curator and the chief usher from the White House. The chair of the committee is the director of the National Park Service. And then it also includes the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, the director of the National Gallery of Art, and the director of the Fine Arts Commission. So you've got a core of people that serve because they have an office, not because they've been appointed. And then others are appointed after the creation of the Endowment Trust, became more of a committee of scholars and advisors and collectors.
And the Endowment Trust that you mentioned, for those who may be listening and don't know, is a component of the White House Historical Association that supports, provides private funding for the conservation and maintenance of some of these things. And also there's an acquisition trust that would be deployed to acquire art and furnishings for the collection. Tell us about some of your favorite things that the association has supported over the years, or some of the most significant works that are in the collection that the association has partnered with the White House to support the acquisition of those items.
Well, one of the more recent ones, we've mentioned a couple of times before, in 1817, President Monroe bought for then was the Oval Room on the State Floor, it wasn't called the Blue Room then, a suite of gilded furniture and was somewhat criticized for overdoing it in the White House. He actually asked for mahogany, and the agents in France sent him gilded furniture. So I don't know that he was completely responsible for the elaborateness of it. But all of it but one table disappeared by the mid-19th century from these sales. And Mrs. Kennedy very famously found the table in storage and brought it back up. And as a result of the news, a chair was found and donated. And little by little, pieces have been donated. So now that there's 10 original pieces out of the 53-piece suite that have come back. But the one the association most recently funded was the acquisition of a fire screen. There were 2 sliding screens that stood in front of the fireplace so that keep the heat off you if you were sitting there. And we knew it existed, and the owner had never shared pictures with us. And suddenly we got a letter one day from the niece of the man who had owned it saying, well, Uncle always said this came from the White House, and he has this letter from your office saying that if we should ever part with this, we should let you know. And so we put it up for auction. And is it true? And then you get caught in that moment where you have, as a federal employee and a government servant, you have to say, yes, it's true, because you know that's going to change the value, because they weren't sure it was true, and they were going to, the auction house was going to advertise it as a French screen of minimal value. So anyhow, as a result, it came up. We come to the association to ask whether the Acquisition Trust has funds, and got a very generous pledge, and fortunately it didn't cost us nearly what we thought it might. And so it has come back and proved to be quite an interesting archival object, showing gilding conditions and upholstery remnants, including threads probably from the original crimson-colored fabric of 1817 that were underneath nail heads. And so we're actually in the midst of a huge project to restore all of the pieces we have of the suite, because January 1st, 1818 will be the day that it was unveiled to the public at the first Monroe New Year's reception in the post-fire White House. And so the screen won't get ready for that. We're trying to get enough chairs and sofas so that we can actually fill up the room, and then we'll go to work on the more difficult things, which would be the screen and the pier table.
How do great American artists have their works represented in the White House collection?
We collect great American artists. We have a list of people we would like to add to the collection that aren't already in the collection. Unlike most museums, we have a prohibition against collecting works by artists who are alive. Principally, the reason is that then everybody will want their painting in the White House, whether they're a great American artist or not. And they will talk to their congresspersons, and who will then talk to the president, and the president doesn't need that kind of pressure. And so we've always had it as a rule, other than commissioning portraits of the outgoing president and first lady, which the association very generously funds each time that's happened since the mid-1960s. So those are artists that come in who get to actually come in and see their paintings hanging. Everybody else has to already be deceased. But it allows us, to get works by an artist in their most important periods. Some people might offer you work and you say, well, that's really a nice George Bellows, but not great enough to be the White House one.
And as we move more into the 21st century, the artists of the middle and late American 20th century are becoming eligible to have works in the collection. What are some recent acquisitions in that vein?
Well, in the Obama administration, President and Mrs. Obama were very interested in abstract art. And the White House had we had none truly abstract. And so it gave us an opportunity to search for some. And we received works as donations mostly from foundations of the artists who were really pleased to have their artists recognized. Joseph Albers, Robert Rauschenberg, Joseph Lichtenstein, and then the association, most generously from the Acquisition Trust, purchased at auction for us, a wonderful Alma Thomas, who was the first African-American woman represented in the White House, who was a Washington, D.C. artist of abstract works. And so, and we created the old family dining room as sort of a venue to place all of this abstract art in one location.
During your 40 years in the White House, you saw these objects and these spaces and these items every day. So they probably became like old friends of yours. Who were some of your favorite friends among the objects in the White House collection?
Well, the portrait of Thomas Jefferson by Rembrandt Peale. That was the one when someone said on 9/11/2001, what would you have saved? I said the portrait of Thomas Jefferson by Rembrandt Peale. Now, it's not because I like it, and I like the portrait of Theodore Roosevelt by John Singer Sargent and the great George Washington by Gilbert Stuart. The only one I could have carried out of that building was the Thomas Jefferson, because it's a standard issue 30 by 25, early 19th century size. But I also said to people, I'm probably being shot for being a looter if I was walking down the street carrying a notable White House painting. I really like the clock in the Blue Room. Mm-hmm. It was acquired in the Monroe administration, partly because it has the curious story of the agents from France wrote back to President Monroe and said, you asked for clocks, we're having trouble finding ones without nudities. Because they were neoclassical figures and they were scantily clad as Greek goddesses and mythological figures and such. So I'm not sure that the White House really needed Hannibal, the Carthaginian general, yes. But he was wearing armor, a full set of Carthaginian armor. And so we have that clock. It still runs. 200 years later, it's still running on the mantle in the Blue Room. So it just kind of has a curiosity behind its history of, one, being a beautiful piece, and two, not being the most obvious selection for the White House.
Well, you bring up the care and keeping of clocks. Tell us about that. How are the many clocks in the White House maintained?
Well, the electric shop is responsible for winding them. And so usually once a week on a Friday, they go around and wind the clocks. We have a regularly scheduled program of maintenance that the association very kindly funds as part of the object conservation, where we have a great clock conservator who comes in and every so many years you have to take the works out and clean and oil and get everything balanced and such. And then he comes in occasionally when we've got clocks when somebody bumps it and it just stops running and it needs a little proper care to get it going again. And so I'm sure the guys at the gate, the security guys, are always worried about the people we have coming in, because the clock guy usually brings all kinds of intricate little tools and, photographers. Bruce White shows up with an enormous battery pack, and it's like, all these things don't look like they're really very safe.
That's right. And Bruce White, as our listeners may know, is a wonderful photographer that contributes to many of our publications here at the White House Historical Association. And we're grateful to you, Bill, and the other curatorial staff for allowing him and authors of our books to have access to the house and the collection to make these educational tools and resources possible. In fact, we have a book coming out this fall by Elise Kirk on music in the White House. And one of the items featured in that book is the Steinway that you often see in the Grand Foyer with the eagle pedestals. Tell us about that particular piano.
That's one of the few things in the 20th century that was up to date. Whereas all the other rooms seem to be kind of frozen in these late 18th, early 19th century styles, Steinway and Company had given the 100,000th piano that the company made to the White House. They were very proud of being Americans, having Hungarian origins. And that piano was beginning to wear out a little bit, and so they offered number 300,000. And so it was specially designed with a very streamlined case, gilded eagles that President Franklin Roosevelt personally approved, in what is frequently called in the city here Greco-Deco, with the idea that it's Art Deco, but it's in the neoclassical style of the Greek revival. And then stenciled with scenes of American music and dance by artist Dunbar Beck. It's quite a treasure. In the 1970s, they were ready to make number 500,000, and Steinway wanted to offer us another piano. And I'm sure they would have designed anything we wanted, but we were so wedded now to this particular piano that instead it went back to the factory in New York, and the works were rejuvenated. The case was cleaned up a little bit, and so it's still going strong. It's played regularly by the Marine Band pianist, rarely by a concert pianist. Usually if they come to White House, they bring their own piano to perform.
And famously by some presidential pianists.
Right. President Nixon played it. Harry Truman played it. They both were well known for playing the piano. President Nixon actually played it at a birthday party for Duke Ellington.
If you put a number on the White House collection today, how many objects and items would be in the White House collection?
I'd say probably about 65,000 maybe.
And how would that compare to the inventory that Lou Hoover did?
Oh, she numbered maybe 300.
My goodness.
But she wasn't numbering any of the china, glass, and silver. That's where an enormous part of that 65,000 is homogeneous sets of matching plates and matching forks and glasses.
And so all of those things that are not on the state floor or in public view or use, are they stored down in your offices in the ground floor of the White House?
Well, we don't store anything in the office. We have on-site storage for small objects, documentary material, small paintings, lamps, things that we might need in a hurry. And then there's storage for all of the services that are brought out by the butlers for food service. And then there's off-site storage for oversized furniture, oversized paintings, rugs, older draperies that are not in use any longer.
And can a new president and first lady or president and first lady who've been there for a while and want to make a change, are they aware of these objects? Do they ever look at what's available and consider how they might be used in the residence or someplace else?
We've never really had a first lady or president want to go to off-site storage. We keep thinking that would be a great treat, but usually they have a staff person and a designer involved in their redecoration activities who go get pictures from us, get measurements, and then they share them with them so that they get it in directly without having to see it in person.
What are some of the more unusual items in the White House collection that someone might think, why is that in the White House collection?
Well, there's a chair that was made out of a log. Somebody sent it to President Hoover in 1932 for the 200th anniversary of the birth of George Washington. It's surprisingly comfortable. It's just kind of a barrel chair. It's like, if you just cut away the part of the front of a log and then hollowed out the inside of it. And I don't know that it ever had any real use until the George W. Bush administration, when Mrs. Bush was doing the solarium, which is a room on top of the south portico that's usually a comfortable family kind of space, and they wanted it to seem a little bit rustic and a little bit outdoors since you had such a great view of the outdoors. And so the designers, he saw the chair. I told him what it was. He says, I think that's fabulous. And so for 8 years, it was a regular part of the furnishings of the solarium.
And now tucked safely away somewhere.
Now it's tucked safely away again.
Looking back on your 40 years and a wonderful career, what are your favorite memories of being the curator and being in the curator's office at the White House?
Well, it was always nice hearing a president or first lady quote your prose. We would give them, guides to the rooms with history of the space, and you'd hear the president doing a tour, and he would start saying things, and it's like, wow, that's just as I wrote it.
Have you ever corrected a president who didn't get it right?
I have. I've tried not to.
I won't ask you the circumstances.
Well, because usually what happens is they look at you and say, right, Bill? And you're like, oh my God, now what am I going to say? Am I going to call him out and say, so you try to sort of spin it a little bit, get it back on track, because every once in a while they've got the gist of the story, but the fine tuning of it might be a little bit off. But my years being the curator since 2002 meant that I worked very closely with Laura Bush and Michelle Obama. And people always say, who's your favorite president, first lady? Well, I think it's usually the ones that you work the most closely with. So the earlier ones where someone else was the boss, I would only come along as needed. So I know working with Mrs. Bush on the refurbishing of the Lincoln bedroom, which is technically in the private quarters, but it's always been treated as kind of a state space. Mm-hmm. And she really wanted it to be, in 2004, it hadn't been changed since 1952. It was pretty much unchanged. So we decided it was the opportunity to research and actually use the documents that showed what that room had looked like as his office and what the bedroom had looked like where the bed and the other furniture that's now in the room had once been.
And we were pleased to contribute to that research.
Right, and the association helped with the research and helped with the financing of it, and she invited the Committee for the Preservation of the White House to consult, even though that wasn't in their purview. She said, well, we've got these bright people, why can we ask them what they think? And so, it's a very elaborate Victorian room now.
Is there one item that you're aware of that's out there someplace that used to be in the White House that you always hoped you would be able to recover but never were able to?
We know there's more Blue Room furniture. We know there's more William King chairs and sofas from the East Room in the Monroe period. We know there's more of various China services that are out there. Some things are in other collections and we're not going to get them back, but we know where they are and we know they're safe. President Hayes bought an enormous, heavily carved in Cincinnati sideboard for the old family dining room. And it was sold at auction in 1902 and bought by a Washington, D.C. saloon owner because he had big enough space to take a sideboard almost as big as the wall behind you. And But later on in the 1950s, it was bought by one of the Hayes children and given to the Hayes Library out in Ohio. So, we'd love to have it back, but it's a wonderful piece for them to have as well. So we're happy when it gets into another museum associated with presidential history.
The first podcast in this series was around the inauguration, and we had Anita McBride talking with us about what that move-in, move-out experience is like. Tell us about what that is like for the curator from the time you wake up that morning, if you've gone to bed the night before, until you put your head on your pillow inauguration night. What is that space of time like for the White House curator?
Well, it starts before then. You usually start having some discussions with the incoming First Lady and her staff about what they would like to do to certain rooms. I mean, they know they can't do too much on the first day, but how many people are they bringing in, who's going to stay overnight, and that kind of thing. So you start making plans, and you start drawing up floor plans so that you can hand them out on the morning of. So if our operations guys or the Park Service guys go to start moving things, they'll know that table goes, this chair stays, this goes over in that corner, that kind of thing. We get there about 5 o'clock in the morning because you can't get through the perimeter otherwise if you don't get there pretty early. But at 10 o'clock when the President First Lady come downstairs to greet the incoming President First Lady and have coffee, that gives us the first opportunity to get to the second floor. If the outgoing couple have been really helpful, as almost everybody has, lots of things of theirs have already departed, or at least are put somewhere where they can quickly be loaded on a moving van that shows up. And then our trucks show up from off-site storage if they're bringing in things that need to be added to the rooms. Vehicles come from Blair House, usually carrying clothing and personal items for the family. And then there's everybody frantically running around trying to get things in place. And then usually the family comes in at 4 or 5 o'clock and is amazed to find out what they had. I remember the time that Mrs. Barbara Bush told the story that when she got her walkthrough with Nancy Reagan, they went in the two rooms that are traditionally used by children, and Mrs. Reagan was using one as a gym and had a universal gym set up in the middle of it. And Mrs. Bush, saw this, and so she had warned her family because she was having her immediate family. Well, the Bush family immediate is like 27 people. So she had warned them, says, you may just be sleeping on a cot next to the gym equipment. Well, that day, the engineers disassembled the universal gym and took it out. We brought in 2 antique beds, antique carpet, hung paintings, and the family all that night at dinner said to Barbara Bush, well, what were you talking about? The rooms are beautiful. Everything is so wonderful. And it was like, because we had pulled off what we were supposed to.
Well, Bill, it's been an honor to talk with you today, and on behalf of the board of the White House Historical Association and my colleagues here, we want to thank you for your many years of service, your expertise, the contribution that you made during those years, and the legacy that you'll have for generations to come. You have truly been a caretaker of America's greatest treasure, the People's House. So thank you very much. It's an honor to have you as a colleague, and it's an honor to have worked with you, and thank you for unpacking your memories for us today.
You're very welcome, Stuart. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you. For those of you who would like to learn more about the role of the curator and the history of the White House, visit us at our website, whitehousehistory.org.
You've been listening to the 1600 Sessions. This podcast is presented by the White House Historical Association and produced by Long Story Short Media. You can subscribe or download new episodes at the1600sessions.org. And please help spread the word by rating us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. You can learn more about the White House Curator and the artifacts they care for at whitehousehistory.org. Thanks again to William Allman, and thank you to the U.S. Marine Band Library, which provided the music for this podcast.